I wanted to start just by telling you a little bit about the timeline that Crenshaw had before and after during the filming of this particular narrative. This particular narrative happened over a period, Lena, of about 8 months, right? Mm-hmm. So just to contextualize it, back around 2005, Crenshaw High School had its accreditation threatened. And I'm sure that sounds familiar, especially considering where I'm standing, right? So the privatization tactics are all kind of similar. So in 2005, the WASC, Western Accreditation of Schools and Colleges, came to Crenshaw High School and said, man, you guys are really doing a really crappy job. But it was mostly all of their concerns, their critiques, centered around the administrative handling of the school, not so much about the actual instruction that was occurring inside the classroom. Nonetheless, the accreditation was still threatened, and the district, of course, tried to spin it as, oh, it's those dang meddling teachers aren't doing their job. So that's kind of how that got spun. What did come out of that, though, is even though the accreditation was threatened, it was never actually revoked. But out of that, community groups, parents, and students at Crenshaw High School formed what was then called the Crenshaw Cougar Coalition. And what they did is they started pushing for reform efforts with the school board, kind of organizing, mobilizing, attending these things, and basically demanding, more resources or more support or whatever the case might be. Some victories, some, stalemates, I guess is how I'll describe it. But ultimately, there wasn't a reform model pushed and developed, but it was grassroots. It wasn't really from the, it wasn't from the district. It wasn't administrative. It was teachers and parents and students working together and collaborating. That partnership. That group of organizers then started expanding and looking for community partners and organizations. We partnered with the USC School of Education. We partnered with the Tom and Ethel Bradley Foundation, the Urban League, the Community Health Council, the Community Rights Campaign, the local community councils, the neighborhood councils that were around in the area. So we started kind of bringing everybody in. We knew that if we were going to be able to survive an attack from the district and be able to mobilize, as it were, an attack back on the district, then we were going to need as many people as possible involved in that. So that led to the creation of what was known as the extended learning cultural model, which basically was a lot of the kind of that liberal arts education that you guys were describing a little earlier. I guess I'll say it like the best parts of the Common Core. But all of it really grassroots. And so we had our students participating in internships with these organizations. They were doing research and training with their, around solving some of the issues in their community. As an example, you saw some pictures of our community garden. That community garden had fallen into disrepair over the last several decades, and with a grant from the Sierra Club and with grants and support from the Community Health Council, we were able to revitalize and bring back that community garden. We had students working in our garden. They were using all of those skills. They were trying to they would market their own little businesses. We would have students who created little fruit tarts out of the things that they created, and then they actually managed to get that sold in the local Starbucks around the community. So those students were able to take these skills and really, really start to apply them into giving them real-world tools, real-world skills. So, that was the kind of thing we were doing. With the Community Health Council, also working with the community garden as an example of what kinds of things they did, was they had our students research brown lots and food access around their community. So they kind of walked around, did community surveys, spoke to parents about nutrition access, and then presented that research to the Community Health Council, and would present it at UCLA IDEA, the Institute for something or another. I don't remember right now, but it was a lot of people involved. And they were presenting this research at City Hall. It was really incredible work. Enter Superintendent Deasy. And that was when all of our work started to become even more threatened. The work we were doing with the extended learning cultural model simply did not fit the narrative of a failing public school in South Los Angeles. So in order for him to maintain that narrative, then he knew he would have to destroy us one way or another. he, as you heard, he came into our school and said, oh, well, you know, I need to see that you guys are making progress in these areas, despite the fact that we did, in fact, increase test scores on some levels. I mean, obviously, there's critiques about standardized tests, which I will leave off to the side for the moment. But even aside from that, even using their metrics, we were making gains. But even still, they were like, oh, well, it's just you're not gaining enough, right? The magnetization process was very ill-planned, I guess is my way of being generous about it. We had gone through processes like that of restructuring the school ourselves. And so that process for ourselves had taken about 1.5 years, 2 years. Their timeline was shortened to about 7 months to restructure the school. With our timeline that we had had before of about 2 years, even from the initial planning to the rollout of our restructuring of our school, you know, nothing's perfect. There were bumps, there were hitches. And we knew that if this district was planning a similar restructuring, but on a much shorter timeline, we knew that they were going to have many, many more issues than the ones we had encountered. But they proceeded forward with it. As you saw, the school board voted unanimously to do that. And there's going to be, I'll talk about that a little bit, about the repercussions of that. You heard one parent say, if you reconstitute Crenshaw, we will reconstitute you. I'll tell you a little bit about that in just a moment. So the reconstitution occurred. They removed about half the staff, a little over half the staff, very destabilizing for the school. As a result of that, 2 major things happened. One is the lawsuit that we filed with the state of California and the Public Employee Relations Board. And the second one was that Alex Caputo Pearl, who previous to that had been a very dedicated classroom teacher, finally listened to all of us, the rest of his colleagues, and ran for UTLA president. He very much so tried to have a collaborative campaign. He was very strategic about the way that he ran his campaign. He had a representative from all areas of Los Angeles. So UTLA is organized similar to the district. You have the entire city of Los Angeles, but you have West area, East area, Valley, Valley West, South Harbor, all of these little sections of it. And he was able to get a representative from each of those areas to run for one of his slates, either treasurer, NEA rep, AFT rep, whatever, like treasurer, secretary. We had everybody. And aside from that, there were also the board of directors, which is like the Congress of our union. They also were able to get a bunch of progressive unionists in those slates to run for election. Every single one of those seats was won. Now, similar to Chicago, we saw that the reconstitution fight led to a complete cleaning house of the old guard in the union. And they were instead replaced with very progressive, very active, a different kind of union viewpoint. Rather than the service union, it moved towards this, I guess I'll describe it for lack of a better word, kind of the syndicalism, more progressive, more anti-capitalist, really bringing in that kind of philosophy into the union that was absent before. And that's what we're seeing now in LA. Our school, as it stands now, we've lost a lot of the programs. Some of the grants that used to be at Crenshaw High School were lost because of the reconstitution. One grant in particular was through the Ford Foundation. They had awarded us $200,000 with an option to renew for about $1.5 million the following year. So you can imagine that's big money. When the reconstitution was threatened, the Ford Foundation went to the superintendent and said, we really want you to reconsider doing this, because if you reconstitute and lose all those teachers, then we have no reason to invest that money. It's those teachers that have been doing all of the work around the pedagogy, the culture of the school. And the superintendent basically said, sorry, Ford Foundation, I'm moving forward. So that money was lost. The community garden has since fallen into disuse, disrepair. It is basically back to being weeds. And the Community Health Council, one of the other things that they had done was, with the budget cuts, we had lost our school nurses, our psych workers, all our psych support, and that's how it is. Community Health Council had brought in their mobile medical lab. to our campus on 3 days a week, and we're able to provide for our students and their families a much more comprehensive medical care than even the LAUSD nurse would have been able to give them. They were able to provide vaccinations, they were able to provide birth control, pregnancy screenings, just kind of general medical care that in our communities, of course, is very difficult to come by. So that was also lost. They are no longer working with Crenshaw, again, because those relationships basically fell apart. So the reconstitution textualized, as I hope many of you may understand, but the reconstitution basically says this school is failing based on the metrics of No Child Left Behind, so we have to reconstitute, we have to get rid of the teachers because that is where the blame is. There's no discussion about the systemic violence that occurs in these neighborhoods, no conversation about poverty, literacy, access to education, employment rates, violence and crime in the community. It's always the teacher's fault, and so that's the message that they were promoting, and that is why they decided to reconstitute Crenshaw. That's its reasons. The future of the reconstitution is that there is no real research from any educational academic organization, whether we cite Stanford, UCLA, USC, any of these major institutions. Their research on reconstitution basically says there's no proof that it works. In fact, it's basically keeping things the same or maybe even slightly worse. So even despite that, there is still a large push towards reconstitution, privatization, charterization of schools, not just in Los Angeles, but around the country. We could, start looking and pointing at just about anywhere here. We could look at New Orleans, Chicago, New York, Pittsburgh. The future of it is that obviously the superintendent has just resigned in Los Angeles. That just happened a couple days ago. Trying to contain my elation.
Our elation.
Right, everybody's, right? I mean, because it's a victory everywhere, right? Because what we're seeing is that, the electorate and the population of these cities is waking up. We saw that kind of, shall we say, that kind of enlightenment occur in Chicago, and we're seeing it start to happen in other places as well. I mean, LA in particular is basically just repeating what Chicago did. The school board fight, you heard the parents say, if you reconstitute Crenshaw, we'll reconstitute you. There was Marguerite Lamont, who was the board member at Crenshaw during that time, passed away shortly thereafter, and there was a big fight for her seat. In one corner was George McKenna, former teacher, and had a lot of grassroots support. And in the other corner was Alex Johnson, whose campaign was funded by, guess who? Bill and Melinda Gates, and of course, Eli Broad. He lost overwhelmingly, because at that point, there had already been so much talk in that community, in that school district section, that everyone was like, well, we see the writing on the wall. We know what's being sold to us, and we're not that stupid. It's the same reason why Alex Caputo-Pearl was able to win the union presidency. Everybody in that community had already heard about Crenshaw. Everyone in the city had heard about Crenshaw. And that, of course, brings me to the role of the union, as far as what the union has been doing for us before and after. During the Crenshaw fight, our union leadership was inadequate. It was milquetoast. But there was a lot of push within the progressive circles of the union to make them more active, to be a little bit more fiery, as I guess the word. Didn't quite happen. But one of the things that we were able to do was change the structure of the union, and now they are being much more supportive, calling not just for the kinds of contract demands that are, let's say, typical of teachers, right? Like increased pay, haven't had a cost of living increase in 8 years. But also fighting for the things that actually affect teachers in the classroom, lower class sizes, the reinstitution of the health and human service professionals that we lost, the push for ethnic studies in classes. the trying to remove the ROTC, which has also really tried to get itself into the public schools. So kind of all of those things, really pushing for it and fighting back on all fronts rather than just trying to stay focused on the one. We see that when unions tend to focus on only pay, then it's easy for the district to be able to say, oh, those teachers are being selfish and they really only care about their paycheck. But by engaging with parents and engaging with the students and asking for contract demands that are also incredibly relevant to them as well as for us, the teachers, then they're already on our side. So that when the school board tries to say, oh, those teachers are being selfish, the parents can hear the bullshit for what it is. So that also then leads to then the discussion of how do we organize, how do we mobilize, and how do we go from simply spreading out information, which is what we're doing here, which is very important, obviously, but to now more proactive solutions. How do you get out into the streets and make that happen, make that change happen? We've got, out of the 7 seats on the school board, 3 of them are now friendly to the teachers union and to the parents and to the community. But that means that we are still losing a lot of the fights that come before the school board. So now we are very concerned about how do we organize the elections for those other 4 seats? How do we get them out of there? Now that the superintendent has left and been replaced with a previous superintendent, then that's the next question. How do we finally get a superintendent or any kind of administrative leadership that isn't in the pockets of these billionaires, that isn't, you know, kind of in favor of the charterization privatization? The system itself is kind of broken. Right? I mean, so how do we push the school board, who essentially does the hiring of the superintendent, to make a good decision? And there's only one way to do that, and that's to threaten them with their seats as well. I mean, it has to be that. But that means that that house also has to be cleaned. And that means that we need the electorate involved, and that means that we really need a major grassroots push around that. So around that, Los Angeles has also developed the movement for the schools that LA students deserve, which is bringing not just the teachers union, not just our affiliates, and not just our own little community groups, but trying to bring in other outside unions, SEIU, Local 99, Teamsters. We're starting to bring in all those other people because this is affecting them too. Those are our parents. Those are their students who are attending our schools. So having them and engaging with other labor organizations is, I think, really the only way that we'll be able to really fight against all of these things that we're seeing in Los Angeles. So, I mean, that's pretty much all the information I have. I want to open it up to question and answers. I'd say that maybe we have around 20 minutes. Before I want to make sure, and I want to honor the time that you guys also have. So, how much would you say? 15? Right. So the teachers were right. So the teachers not only filed a PERB complaint regarding alleging wink, right, saying that the reason we were removed was for our union activity, for our protected, legal rights under Ed Code and under labor law, but also parents were filing uniform complaints with the state of California. There was also, you heard that 21 of the 33 teachers that were released were African American. So discrimination was also filed with the state of California. Those, as you know, that also has these kind of slow legal wheels that slowly churn. So a lot of those things have been right. Right. Right, and so, that's also kind of part of the issue is, right, we're also seeing that lots of budgets, in particular for our union, had also been decimated, and we'd been fighting a lot of fights. And so I know that some organizations took up some of those teachers. I know that the ACLU was working with some of those parents, but again, these things are also really hard to prove, and so even though we can file,
what you were doing
right,
is the way it's supposed to work.
Oh no, I know. But I think the other thing that we also, must be mindful of is that there are other laws that contradict those laws, right? It's specifically No Child Left Behind and that as law, which allowed the district to basically come in here and just basically start clear cutting. Okay, so I want to move on. I see.
Not without the community, not against the community.
Well, that's the lawsuit.
I came into the film in November of 2012. I found out about what was going on at Crenshaw. At that time, Crenshaw and another school, Dorsey, were both fighting reconstitution battles, and Dorsey was able to win theirs. And then I followed the story from about December of 2012 until, I'm still kind of following the story presently. And Alex Caputo Pearl was my main entry into everyone else. He's someone who I had known before I started filming, and just kind of stalked him a little bit and badgered him a lot. And then eventually he was able to put me in touch with a bunch of teachers and a bunch of parents and students. And we all became kind of collaborators. About half of the footage that was in the film is shot by students, because I wasn't allowed to film in the school, as you saw. So now we just screened the film in LA for 10 days, and then have been here since Thursday. We were at Stanford. Linda Darling Hammond runs a fantastic center at Stanford called Scope. So we were there earlier this week. Last week, we were in several LA high schools where we screened the film to about 1,000 high school students. We were at UCLA, public libraries. We'll be at Berkeley on Monday. And then I'll probably be arranging screenings. And I'm from Washington, D.C. originally, where this is also happening. So I'll go home and screen it in D.C., in Chicago, in New Orleans, in New York. Simultaneously, I'm entering it into film festivals, which is why I can't make it public, yet at least. Once that's over, then I'll try to get an education distribution so that it can be available to universities.
Yeah, I think, it's a crazy relationship with them. And so for myself, I'm just like, I don't really care about placating the LA Times. I'd be much more happier with, say, for example, one of the things that's been happening lately is a lot of the activists have been, filming their own little things, putting them on YouTube, sharing them on social media, and trying to get away from, because the LA Times is part of the systemic oppression anyway. I don't really want to work with them in the first place, right? Because they're not really giving us airtime. They'll give us airtime, but when are they going to air it? 6 in the morning on a Sunday? I'm not really interested in that. So a YouTube video, for example, and something we could disseminate, and it doesn't have to be YouTube. There's at this point like hundreds of different places that can kind of disseminate that information, but starting to think about who's the person who's doing that. And I think for ourselves as activists, we usually think, or at least for myself, I'm just like, okay, I have these meetings to attend, I have this caucus to attend, I have to go to here, there, and the other. I can't do it. But that's part of the education process, right? That we say who in this room or who in my network is able to do that, is willing to do that, has the expertise to do it. I couldn't do what Lena did. I have absolutely no training in that kind of thing. But having those folks and reaching out to community partnerships, local universities and colleges, and putting the hands in the those means of production, putting them in the students' hands. You film what's happening in the school, kid, because it's your school and you care about it more than any adult outside of the school could ever care about it. So that kind of revolutionary thinking is necessary.